All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Technology Adoption Model for Enterprises. I'm your host for today. I'm Mike Provenzano. I'm the VP of Customer Success here at Acrolinx. Little housekeeping to get through before we get started. Today's webinar will be recorded. If you have any objections to being part of the recorded portion, please feel free to drop off the line now. You'll still receive a recorded copy of the broadcast once we complete that today. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A function down on the right-hand side of the presentation panel. We will leave about 10 minutes or so at the end of the presentation to cover any questions that have been submitted throughout the webinar, as well as a few we have received from folks prior to the live session today. So I'm joined today by someone I would actually consider a friend, Rudy Chang. Rudy is a managing director at DDG, or the Discover Digital Group. Little bit about Rudy. Rudy helps his clients apply digital strategy, marketing, technology, and data, as well as innovation practices to define how they delight customers, build products, go to market. Rudy has led many technology-intensive transformation programs in multiple industries. Formerly, he was our client here at Acrolinx at IBM, where he helped build out the company's digital marketing program that operated demand generation, IBM.com, e-commerce, events, and CRM. Prior to that, he led digital transformation. He formed a partnership that built a multi-million-dollar SaaS business, provided millions of eBay sellers a secure and easy way to print shipping labels within their auctions. He's an experienced keynote speaker. He leads workshops. He works consulting practices and things like that throughout the country. He focuses on agile methods, marketing, and enterprise transformation. Rudy holds a BS in engineering and architecture from Princeton University and an MBA from RPI. For those of you that have been to Troy, New York, it is lovely this time of year. He is a board member of the American Marketing Association, located in Fairfield County, Connecticut. For me, just a very little bit about me for those of you who don't know. Like I said before, I am Mike Provenzano, the VP of Customer Success here at Acrolinx. Prior to Acrolinx, I too was an IBMer, just like Rudy. I was focused in the Watson Group, or in the BI and HCM solutions. And I spent basically the last 20 years of my life in SaaS and services and operations, helping companies roll out new solutions, design solutions, as well as project management and sales and operations. So before we get started, make sure that everything is working here. So there we are, Rudy Chang and Mike Provenzano. So what brought us here today? These are some of the things that I've heard in my career, and Rudy's heard during his career, and I'm sure you've heard the same thing. I like what tools like Acrolinx do, but I can't explain the benefits in financial terms or executives, or even my CFO. We hear this all the time. And it's not just Acrolinx or just any other solution. Think of any solution within your organization. More often than not, the people that champion that solution or make a case to buy that solution really have a tough time tying that back to financial impact or business impact. All too often we hear things like, "I bought this solution because I thought it would help us, change this process or do this differently or just make us more efficient." Other things, we talk about expansion and things like that all the time with our customers and, sort of streamlining this process across the organization. When we hear things like, "It'd be great if everyone across the company used this, but how do we make a case for the extra spend?" Right? Again, that ties back to point number one. If we can't tie this back to financial metrics or business impact, it's tough to make a follow-on case to expand that deployment out. We really need to change the way we work in order to get the full value or ROI of our tools, right? This is, sort of the chicken and the egg statement, right? Is it your process, or is it the tool that needs to change? Or is it, maybe even the evaluation period or the solution design or change management within your organization that really needs to happen to get the most out of your tools? This is one of my favorites. From time to time, I have been involved in projects historically, of course, never at Acrolinx, where we get to the point and it's the delivery phase. And, we step out in front and we do our great executive presentation and we hear things like, "Did you even listen to me when I gave you the requirements?" I'm sure you've worked with internal teams. I'm sure there's folks here that have, developers and project managers and, tech teams that are dedicated to their team. I'm sure you've all found yourselves in this situation before, being a former product manager and things like that. Like I've definitely heard this. I've definitely seen that. And I've definitely, had these words come out of my mouth, right? Where it's, you think you designed this very elegant solution, then it comes back and you're like, wow, it kind of looks like chitty, 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 bang, bang. Perhaps we should reevaluate what we're designing here. So a little bit about today. Two main objectives for today that we're going to try to get to. How to couple technology-based solutions to business value and how to scale that value across your enterprise. The agenda, very quickly, we're going to focus on the problem. We're going to dive right into the framework. That's really where you get the most value here. Rudy's going to take us through the details of the framework and the system that he's put together, that he's seen work across many, many organizations. How to take that framework and then translate that into achieving business impact at scale. Positioning your organization for success. This is really about, even before you get started. About Acrolinx is actually, we moved that to the back for the appendix based on time for today. We'll get to the end, some quick hit takeaways, sort of little nuggets of knowledge that you can take with you, stick in your pocket, and get ready to use for your next deployment. We'll talk about Rudy and his services through DDG. And stick around. There's prizes in this webinar. So everyone that sticks around to the end, and actually everyone that's registered will be entered for prizes here at the end of the webinar. We will be explaining those and drawing them a little bit later. So the problem. Here it is in sort of its most simple form. Failure rates for enterprise software deployments range anywhere from 50% to 90%. Now, that may seem like a big range, but let's start at the first figure here. 50%, right? 50% failure rate. Let's call it a $1 million investment, $500,000 investment, even a $100,000 investment, right? If you have a 1 in 2 chance of failing, should you even start this large change management initiative within your organization, right? Should you go forward with the solution, right? Do you want to be the person that takes their risk or raises their hand to say like, ooh, I have an idea, this is what I want to do, if you knew that you would fail 1 out of every 2 times? 9 out of 10, this, may seem overstated or even bloated for those of you that, maybe aren't familiar with the webinar that this happened in. This was actually a webinar a few years back with the CEO of ServiceNow and the CEO of MindTouch. And they were talking about sort of like failure rates over their careers that they have seen with customers. The first one, 1 in 2, actually comes from a McKinsey benchmark study that they did in 2016. Second one is a webinar from 2016 as well, actually, between those 2 CEOs. Failure reasons, I actually went back and I took a look at sort of, all of the renewals that I had access to for data over my career in the last, 20 years or so of doing services and renewals and things like that. They boil down really to these top 5, right? You lose your champion, you have a failure to create user adoption or traction, however you want to measure it, failure to measure value, loss of budget or momentum, and the effort to administrate the solution, right? Really, if we boil all of these down, you can really tag each one of these reasons to proper change management or proper program management, right? If you manage your program properly, if you lay the groundwork properly, losing your champion really shouldn't be a big deal, right? There should be someone waiting in the wings, just coming right behind you. Again, failure to measure value, starting at the beginning, making sure that your problem statement, your hypothesis about the solution, really is a value and an impact driver. This is actually a second study here from McKinsey, and they focused on the role of change management in enterprise software rollouts, and basically they correlated that back to ROI, and what they're saying is companies that take a programmatic change management approach to their enterprise software rollouts are destined to see a much higher return on investment, right? We're looking at 143% versus 35%. clearly, if we say, focus on the beginning, focus on the framework, and focus on the foundation, change management and organizational readiness, as well as, impactful solution, or I'm sorry, impactful problem statement, sound hypothesis, and experimentation around the solution really are the frameworks to getting that ROI back out. In essence, what we're saying here, and this is my super oversimplification, living in a house with 2 children under 8 years old. Really, you want to start here, right? Start with the grand vision. I want to build this, multi-tiered castle, multi-tiered cake, whatever it is. But on your way to that destination, really focus on the small stuff. Okay? Every pail that you fill, every shovel that you put into that pail, make sure it is the right ingredient to get you to your end destination. There's sports analogies all over the place that are about, sweat the details and focus on the little stuff. This applies across enterprise software as well, right? One misstep, a number of missteps that may seem inconsequential at the time can lead you to being one of those 1 and 2 or 9 and 10, depending on who you ask for, from a failed deployment perspective. So we have a little poll question for you today. There's a number of folks here registered for the webinar, a number of folks that have actually written in prior to the webinar. Let's talk a little bit about it. What brought you here? Right? Maybe you're evaluating your next solution that you want to roll out. Maybe you've had a failed deployment in the past, and you want to say, maybe these guys have an idea about why that deployment failed. I have a very successful deployment today, but I need to know how to take it to that next level. I need to know how to scale it. I need to know how to make that business case to say, like, this is good now, but if we just dump some more fuel on that fire, it's going to get even better. This is common. Again, I struggle to tie my solutions to business value. Everybody needs technology today to do their job. More often than not, almost every role in the organization has some tie to a solution or some technology that's been rolled out. But the hard part starts when someone says, like, how do I tie this to the value you're bringing to the organization? NDE, more than one of these, or maybe even none of these. If you have other suggestions of reasons why you're here, maybe you're just a big fan of Rudy Chang. Maybe you're an IBMer. Two former IBMers on a panel. You don't see that very often. Any of those things, feel free, throw them in the chat. Maybe we'll change the poll question for tomorrow. So without further ado, enough of my meandering thoughts here. I'm going to take you through to Rudy Chang here, who's going to discuss his framework with you. Rudy, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Mike, and very kind words. Glad to be here. So over the course of many of these, I'll call them technology-centric transformation programs, digital transformation, marketing, and sales type use cases, I've put together I call this my framework. It's kind of like a high-level checklist in terms of when you are embarking on a program, the steps that seem to fall into place time and time again fall into these 3 buckets in my point of view. The first thing is kind of like with Mike's sandcastle, right? What is the outcome you're envisioning? What is the way in which the business is going to operate in the future? Ultimately, what that requires are a clear problem statement, right? So can you articulate the business opportunity or the problem you are solving? And the key thing is, can you measure it? And this is a one of those things. I think it was on Mike's chart, right? 40% of the time, if you can't quantify business value, even if the project is good, may cause a project to fail. Things like the business case. Is your idea important? And this is what I mean by alignment to strategy, right? It may be a good idea, but is it actually the most important burning issue for the business that you're in? And again, key thing is around linking the measurement of what I call the financial and the operational metrics together. And those are not always easy to do. The second stage that we're going to walk through is what is the state of your organization? And one of the key constructs here is, and I'm going to talk about a little later in more detail, but if you think about any software that you are implementing, and it doesn't matter, this could be the first day that you ever used Microsoft Excel to running your whole back office on SAP, to perhaps running a new marketing automation platform. Every piece of software that's built has an inherent way of doing work that the software designer and the software architect had envisioned. And if you don't understand what that model is against the way that your company operates today, that's been a pitfall that I've seen in many projects when you don't have that clear understanding in terms of how the software was intended to work versus how the company is actually organized. The other elements too, and which I think is it really necessary? Probably not, but I'll say that those companies that have some degree of agile methods in terms of how they go about breaking problems down, how they go about from a project management model. I do find that those that adopt an agile, what I'll call an agile product ownership model around these software implementations and solutions have a higher success rate than those who don't. And then the last piece, which is around scaling, right? And we're going to talk about some different paths in terms of if you have a pilot, and then you can say, where do I go from here? And we'll talk a little bit about the concept of paths to scale and and also the magic of API strategies in terms of enforcing those standards. So Mike, why don't we go to the next slide? Okay, so I'm going to walk through here in terms of it's not the only way, but this is something that it's a methodology that I've used across many different engagements in our clients around how do you actually envision the future. So we do start with a customer journey lens. And we're going to walk through a couple models and ways of actually how do you actually take the customer journey and then map the value of the software to ultimately this concept of linking operational and financial metrics together. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that we've done, and I think depending on the kind of company that you work for, the term enterprise, larger companies, they tend to have multiple business units that target different kinds of customers and sell different kinds of things. So you have different audiences, different solution sets. I could tell you as an example, there could be software companies that are selling large solutions, custom with services to the government, to other enterprises, and they may also sell products and services that are sold for subscriptions down to $20 a month. The way you sell and engage that audience is very different across the same company. So understanding the different routes to market and the different patterns of how marketing and sales, as an example, and service work together to engage an audience, to attract them, to convert them to sale, and whatever that object is that you're selling, whether it's a service, a piece of hardware, or a software subscription, it doesn't really matter. But the point is, if you can actually map out what your interaction patterns are, you can then start to get an understanding. If you go to the next slide, you can get an understanding of what that actual funnel looks like with regards to your functional, the way the company is organized from a function perspective. And this is where on this view, you can start to think about, marketing, sales, and operations. And when it comes to that customer journey, think of this as the back office view, right? So in terms of marketing's role in identifying and targeting an audience, what are the things that kind of drive the marketing machine? And what are those levers of marketing that ultimately drive marketing ROI? So for instance, in the top row, you can see things like if you are producing content and that content has to be of a certain caliber and quality, it's going to have certain benefits. With the better the content is, the higher your SEO rank is. Perhaps you have more efficient paid media spending. If the experience is better, you'll have lower bounce rates, you'll have better click-through rates, and you can start to see a way of breaking down the benefits here across the different parts of the customer journey. Ultimately, where you start to pick the levers of improvement with the software that you are implementing, this is a way to start to map out and to at least identify this concept of marketing, or I'm sorry, operational metrics that drive to very specific financial outcomes. So if we go to the next page, right? So one of the things we do is, after we map out what I'll call a pattern of engagement across the customer journey, we start to build hypotheses that we know that we can test, and ultimately those hypotheses that we can test start to become your pilots. And it's a very basic thing, right? It says if I do X, then Y happens, right? So it's kind of like an if then, if then do this. The idea here is, if you could start to develop very clear hypothesis statements that target those example of those metrics in where they are in that customer journey, you should start to be able to build a hypothesis statement that builds to this business case that says, example, in the early part of the funnel, right? If I can create higher quality content, organic, then I should be able to increase traffic. And it's bite-sized, right? You're not going to say that if I increase content on day one, I'm going to increase my deal size by 10 times, right? That's too far of a stretch. Well, by breaking these things down into sequence of benefits along that customer journey, you can then start to isolate the pilots that you put in, and ultimately a measurement system that with confidence. One of the problems that I've seen many times, and depending on how complex your organization is, it's very hard to look at something that's early stage in the funnel and immediately jump to a conclusion that it has an impact all the way at the end of the funnel in terms of deal size or revenue or whatever renewal rate. So by kind of looking at chunks of the funnel and where you can influence improvement and measurement, if you string these things together, ultimately that's a way that we've been able to actually build a case with confidence without having this leap of faith of from the left end to the right end of that whole customer journey. So let's go to the next slide. All right, let's talk a bit about the concept here now on the organization side. So if you start to build a hypothesis instead of business cases, now let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about what I mentioned before, which is inherent ways of working that the software comes with, and that you have to understand, and then you either have to make a choice. Do you modify the software, or do you modify the way you work? In most cases, the faster route to the return on investment is modifying the way you work, as opposed to modifying the software. We all know that becomes a death trap, right? If you're constantly modifying software, you're going upstream every time there's, and in many of these, in really, when you think about the modern software universe, right, you're just using a shared piece of infrastructure, right? There's actually very little modification you can do, because these are all cloud-based, and they all have fairly, even though they say they're very flexible, but they all have these intended models. So here's just a couple examples, right? We took Marketo. Marketo is in the marketing automation space. They have a very specific, I'll call it, framework of the way that they believe the marketing operations function should work. So how does that, if you're going to put in a new marketing automation function and a new marketing management, marketing resource management system, right? How does that compare with the way your organization is set up with roles and responsibilities? An example in the CMS space, Adobe Experience Manager, right? There's and it's not just Adobe, but most CMSs at the enterprise level, right, have constructs of workflow, and they have permissions, and they have roles, and they have standards and things like standard templates. If your organization, right, is not set up with that discipline, then when you put in that software, it becomes a big shock to people because they've never seen it before. It takes something as simple as Google Analytics, right? It's a great analytical tool, but there's concepts that are built into Google Analytics that if you don't understand those constructs, you actually can't understand the way the software works. So again, I'm kind of beating this topic a little bit, beating a dead horse here, but it really is one of the things I've seen time and time again, where if you don't take a step back and really understand what does the operating model of the way the software works versus the way my organization is set up. If you don't hit that on day one, you will have a very high likelihood of failure in your project. Let's go to the next page. Okay. Now this is another part of organization readiness, right? So I talked about the user base and understanding. We talked about how do you create this the outcome of the vision, and how do you link it to a financial business case, which perhaps you can use to get executives and your CFO around an idea for an investment. A key piece now of the success model is this role, right? So you in the middle, right? And here we've called it the solution champion. In other lives, we've called this the product owner. But this role is very critical because it balances, 29 different things at once. And so I'm not gonna. You can read the slide in terms of all the constituents and the coordination and the actual daily activities. But it's very critical that this role, there's a discipline and a maturity that's needed to actually do this kind of job correctly. So one of the things Mike, if you just go back one step, yeah. So one of the ways that in which you would think about what this role is very much like a product manager. So if you were yourself in the software development business, you would have a role of product manager that's looking at the different markets. You're talking to engineers. You're looking at the competitive market space. Think of this role of the solution role as a very similar role to a product manager in a software company, except that here you're actually not building the software. You are implementing software that's already been built. But there's a lot of issues that you need to start to think about. And when you chunk out the sequence and the different phases of a project, that again, I'll just reemphasize, this is a very critical role in the success model of these kinds of implementations. All right, so we'll go to the next page. All right, so now we're going to talk about let's say we're at the point where we believe the environment is right. We understand, we've done process gap analysis. We really understand the impact of how many users are going to change the way they work with a new solution. But now we want to start to think about paths to scale across an enterprise. And then not only that, when you think about paths to scale, it's not just a technology question, but it really becomes, you're really entering into issues of business policy, enterprise standards, and governance around that model. So how do we, let's go to the next few slides are going to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about here. So this is a very simplified, but I think common way of looking at the way most enterprise organizations are structured, right? They're structured around the construct of business units. There's usually some sort of a corporate function or set of shared services that provide services to multiple business units. And then there's this third dimension, right? So geographies, markets, and regions. And this is where you're dealing with localization, translation, adaptation of perhaps one type of business in it, but perhaps it's sold in a model. In fact, we're working right now, we have a very large insurance client, and the same kind of product that's sold in the US is actually, what's sold through perhaps employers in Asia is sold through banks. And it's a very different route to market model, even though the actual product is the same. So those dimensions, I think of this as a three-dimensional graph when I think about navigating an enterprise structure. And when we start to think about you have an opportunity to change the way you do business, but how do you actually get that now across the board? So let's go to the next slide. And we have, I'll call it use case number one, right? So the pilot, and perhaps you live within one business unit. Maybe you live in a division of a business unit, but you start in one corner. So there are a couple options here that I've seen, that I've seen. So let's go to the next slide. So one is to say, I've proven this use case. I have a pilot that was very successful, and guess what? There's an opportunity if I can take that same exact use case or something very similar and replicate it across the board. And again, I'm talking about the scale, horizontal scale. It all depends on the kind of business you're in. If you are in a business that has, I'll call it business units that play nicely together and want to share common practices, then this is a very viable, right? If you have an environment that allows to take ideas that are successful in one and replicate them across the board, this may be one path that is easier for you to do. Other companies are different. Other companies have business units that are more like holding companies, and they don't really talk to each other. They don't really share these kinds of things, in which case this path may not be for you. So let's look at another alternative. Next page. The other alternative is to say, well, maybe if you're in one of those holding companies and you have, a business that literally is selling jet planes versus the other business is selling donuts, this may be the better path, which is one business unit but similar use cases, but drawing that around that other dimension, the Z dimension of geography. Perhaps I could take this idea and I start it in the US, or maybe I start it in Canada and I roll it to Japan, I roll it to China. That's another path. Then let's look at the other idea that we've seen. Again, this all depends on the other idea is to say, if you live within one business unit, but you may actually have a better path to expand the number of use cases and create that value around your solution across multiple use cases, but still within we'll call it your home, right? Within the one unit that you're in. And perhaps maybe this is the culture of the company you're in requires that pilots are more fully baked, more fully scaled out within one unit before they even start to consider bringing them across the board. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things that you don't want to do that I have found I'll find very difficult to do is to navigate any two of these dimensions at the same time. And this is when you think about rolling out a solution at scale and really understanding the landscape and the readiness across the organization. My message here is, again, based on my experience, don't try to climb multiple dimensions at once. Pick one and be successful at it. Again, going back to Mike's analogy of the shovel and the pail and the castle. So ultimately, this could be the picture of what your castle looks like in your dream that says everyone around the world in every business is using this solution across all of these scenarios. Wouldn't it be great? But this is not, and this is not only is it not an overnight journey, the path in which you navigate and traverse is really critical. All right. So again, those are all things without knowing each individual person on the webinar here and the kind of organization you're at, but it's just food for thought in terms of how you navigate this path to scale. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a concept that we'll take a minute on, which is, I really believe that at some point, no matter how good your solution is, how much you've proven that it is good for the company, good for customers, good for profit and value, at the end of the day, voluntary adoption rarely becomes a standard, right? So if you think about other kinds of systems that are put into your company, and they're things that we're used to, right? So CRM systems have been around forever. And there are certain inherent policies around what a CRM system is there for. For instance, if you're a salesperson, right, you are required to put in things like your opportunities and your leads so that if your upper management is looking at the sales pipeline, they're expecting that people are using that system so that they have visibility to the pipeline. The same thing if you call in, right, for customer service, it's expected that those inquiries are logged into the CRM system because that's policy, right? We have to understand all the conversations we've had with customers. Think about travel expenses, right? I'll call it usually not a great user experience. So I don't want to use that as a model for user experience, but from a policy perspective, right? Most places have a corporate charge card. You are required to file expense reports within a certain amount of time. And guess what? If you're late, you start to get emails. Emails go to your boss. Ultimately, right, the policy says if you don't do it properly, it could actually lead to you getting fired. And so if you think about other examples of solutions that are put in and they're enforced by a policy, they're hardwired into your enterprise so that there's actually no other way to do it. Again, going back to the travel expense system, right? There is no other solution to get reimbursed for travel expenses. There's usually one solution to do it, and if you don't use that solution, you don't get reimbursed for it. So think about, what if your solution that you put in had the same enforceability as these kinds of examples? Example in the CMS space, right? What if you were to say, no more hand-coded HTML, right? It has to be done through the publishing system, and then you lock down your system so that you prevent manual file uploads from being put into the server, right? You create paths where a single system can only talk to another system for that particular job to get done. So this is, again, a key thing around driving scale, because again, I'll just use the term that the volunteer process rarely works at a scale level. And let's go to the next slide. So this is a model that I've used in many examples and previous engagements, which is, here's the life cycle, right? This is kind of looking at the entire life cycle of a solution. We talked about how you start up front with a hypothesis that drives to a pilot. You are ensuring that when that pilot is executed, that you can actually measure it, and that those measurements, those KPIs, have been agreed to as the way that we are going to understand the value of the outcome of this initiative. And then when you start to think about this concept of actually piloting and scaling, this is really where that phase, you've proven the hypothesis, right? You've proven something's worked, but now you're going to get it to the point where you're proving it. I call it that you're proving that it's good enough. It's good enough to become the corporate standard for whatever process is that you are trying to enact. And at that point, right, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be good enough. And this is where you get the mandated adoption, right? This path to scale, again, you choose the dimension based on the appropriateness of your company, but the scale comes with mandate, right? It comes with a very heavy hand that moves the business into that new model. And those things are enforced just like the expense system, right? They're enforced by API, they're enforced by business process and policy, and ultimately where I get to at the last stage, which is where I call the policy equals platform, platform equals policy, right? So it's one and the same. So this is just a way to think about, you could put whatever time scale you want, but the idea is the adoption phase is a hockey stick, right? It's really meant to say we are going to move the company, we're going to move the needle in a very concerted way. And let's go to the next slide. And so this is think of this as what I ultimately view, these are not necessarily all individual people, but these are the roles that your team should have at play when you are developing a solution and ultimately driving it to scale. And these are the kinds of roles, again, depending on your company's agile adoption, the adoption of agile. You may either have a project manager or more of a scrum type role. There's a very distinct thing around practitioner community. We didn't really talk about that on the webinar here for time, but there is a distinct role around creating that sense of community around the platform and the solution that you're building, and having that be as a way to understand feedback and to really drive communication. And then you can see the other roles on here. The right side of the page is really meant to be the coordination and the orchestration, most likely with your provider's professional service organization, let's say like Mike's organization at Acrolinx, right? So, when you start to think of this as the ecosystem of the success team, all of these roles have to, be at play. But that product owner role, or the solution owner that we talked about, this is that glue, right, that keeps it together. So why don't we go to the next slide?
There we go. All right. Well, Rudy, I think that takes us through the framework, and we're on takeaways here. So folks, we're gonna take sort of like the very high level takeaway nuggets that you can go with here. Since I'm the simple one on the call, I'll do the simple ones. Rudy will take over on the next slide and take you through the details and more of the engineering mind that Rudy has with how to basically put these principles into practice. If you think about it from a overall guiding principle perspective, this is where we're at from today's webinar. Think globally, but act locally, right? Again, we'll just pull it back to the sandcastle analogy because it just it makes the most sense here. Think about the destination, think about the big picture and the place that you want to get to. But when you act and when you're thinking about what task you do today, make sure that task affects the outcomes locally. Start with the end in mind. Same thing, right? When you're designing a solution, when you are thinking about evaluating vendors, when you're thinking about sort of do I or do I not? There is no try, as Yoda once said. Start with the end. Is it worth your effort to get to that end, right? Is it an actual impactful change? Which again takes us to our next point, right? Act with an impactful, measurable, and important problem to solve. Make sure that it has some momentum into the business that you can then draw that business outcome or that financial outcome to make sure it gets the right attention, right? We're all gonna be pulling on the rope really hard when we're working through these solutions and when we're trying to redesign process or going through any change management process. Make sure to borrow a phrase from my grandmother, make sure the juice is worth the squeeze on this one, right? If you're gonna pull through hard, make sure that the impact that you're gonna have on the business is worth the effort that you're gonna put in, as well as the effort of those people around you. Once you've gone through all of those steps, keep testing your hypothesis and your solution set, prove that it works, collect the data, and share it out, right? Solutions in a silo are great for that silo, but really where that solution gets to have even greater impact, as Rudy said, the hockey stick of adoption is scaling it, right? If you can create a solution that becomes the universal standard platform across your organization, and some of us are working in organizations that are 500,000 employees strong, that's really where you get to sort of be ascended as the champion for this solution in your organization. Any organization or any vendor that you do business with should be in the business to make you look good, right? So this comes back to what is that impactful problem that I'm trying to solve at my business that really sort of even for those introverts in the audience today, like at some point the spotlight should shine on you for bringing the solution forward and designing it in the team and things like that. It's not just you, it's everyone who works on the solution. But if you start with that impactful problem, at some point that spotlight's going to turn to you and the team that help roll it out across the business. Rudy, a little deeper dive?
Yeah, sure. So, if you look at the stuff we talked about today, I broke this into those, think of this as your checklist, right? And it's we talked about the importance of having the clarity of problem, alignment on the right measures, the ability to measure before you even pilot, and that's a real way to not have to try to kind of backtrack and get more stakeholders involved after the pilot, right? So you kind of want to bring these folks and everyone on board at the beginning. And then we talked about these concepts, right, around organization readiness, whether it's the platform owner itself, it's the user base, it's really understanding, doing that process gap analysis between how software is intended to work versus the way your organization works. And then we talked about paths to scale, right? And how do you ultimately create your solution so that it becomes part of the enterprise standard, where if somebody doesn't use it, they're actually breaking policy, right? So think of this as the checklist at a more detailed level. And if you go to the next slide, here's the shameless plug on DDG, and anything that I'd love to, if anyone has any questions after the webinar. These are the kinds of things we do with clients that follow this model. And I'm not going to read every bullet point here, but you can kind of see the kind of work we do to help clients from beginning to end, from strategy and roadmap development to the actual portfolio of business cases and projects, and all the way we actually do help organizations with actual program management, right? And through our flex team approach. So anyway, so that's the DDG story right now. And I'm trying to remember what's the next slide, Mike.
I'm trying to get the slide to change. There we go. Very impactful slide. You know, two handsome gentlemen there for the audience to gander upon. So I said, stick around. There will be prizes. Let's talk about the prizes here. So you have Rudy, Chang, you have myself. We will be drawing one prize winner from all of the attendees to the webinar. For a half-day workshop to help you guys actually work through this in real time at your company. Whether it's, you're trying to, you may be a prospect of Acrolinx, you may not be a prospect of Acrolinx, you may be a customer of Acrolinx. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Acrolinx technology. We'll sit with you, we'll help you sort of design this program for, the organizational readiness, change management, things like that. With you for, maybe it's just a process initiative that you have or anything like that. But, this is the outcome of sitting here and listening to us drone on for an hour. You get to sit there and listen to us drone on for another 4 hours. So that's what we're looking for here, and hopefully get you guys set up well for a successful implementation somewhere down the road. Everybody here who is an Acrolinx customer, hopefully you know about content connections at this point. Second prize is actually complimentary pass to Content Connections, as well as a pass to the VIP reception that will be happening this year in Boston. This is a reception Rudy may or may not have been at last year. We do about 10 to 12 guests at this reception every year. We do a special offsite dinner, usually a chef's tasting menu and a wine menu at one of the restaurants or establishments around the event venue this year. We are actually looking at doing a chef's table with Barbara Lynch this year for Content Connections. So we're working on confirmations and things like that for that. For anyone of you that are familiar with Barbara Lynch, you will know that chef's table with Barbara Lynch it's just great. So it's a really great prize for this webinar here. And third prize, complimentary pass to Content Connections. This one is not limited to one. We'll actually be doing a couple from the drawing here. And this will be both registrants and attendees. So without further ado, we are right at 11:20. Let's move on to questions. So there's three that I can see. First one, Rudy, I'm gonna let you take this one, and then maybe I'll respond. First question is, if we've already deployed a solution and haven't gone through an adoption or value exercise or change management exercise, is it worth it to do it retrospectively or retroactively rather?
Yeah, I think so. The answer is if you have a solution that's already been to the point where it's become locked in and policy, maybe not. But if you're not at that stage, I think in this day and age, every investment is subject to a last minute cut. Right? We always live in a cost-cutting environment, and one of the problems is if you cannot demonstrate value, if you don't have your solution that is has enough, we'll call it established credibility in terms of the value it generates to the business, it could become very easily a line item on somebody's spreadsheet that gets cut. Maybe it gets cut 50%, 10%, 100%, but you don't want to be in that position. So I think the more you can, even if you have to do it a bit retrospectively, I would think of that as kind of like a little bit of insurance. Again, it's no guarantee, but usually the solutions that have very clear metrics and very clear visibility to senior executives, those tend to stand a better chance than those that don't. So I would say the answer is yes to that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Second question. You touched on executive sponsorship and attention from the executive team at the beginning. From my experience, they're busy people and it's tough to get their attention. Do you have any specific techniques that you've used in the past to help garner executive sponsorship? I'll take it first and then kick it over to you. Executives are people just like everybody else who works in your organization, right? That's the first thing that you got to keep in mind when you're reaching out. You're doing these types of things to get sponsorship. They're motivated. They have goals in place. The organization has goals in place. Their role as a leader in the organization is to help drive those organizational goals. The thing that I have found to be most successful is to sort of, I don't know, turn the mirror around, turn the lens around, and think about what's important to those people, and position your solution in a manner that translates well into their world. So if you're trying to get executive sponsorship from the CFO, you should be talking about things like margin and profit and EBITDA and things like that. If you're talking to the chief revenue officer or someone else in the sales organization as your executive sponsor, again, you may not be directly involved in pipeline creation or closing business or mid-funnel velocity, right? Like these are concepts that are foreign to you, but this is the language that they speak. So make sure when you're going in and you're trying to garner their sponsorship that you're speaking their language and you know what's important to them, in order to get them to back you on your solution or your hypothesis and to help bring it forward. Lastly, one point. Not every solution is going to launch with an executive sponsor right from the word go, right? You may just have an economic decision maker or something like that in the organization. But once you have that successful pilot in place, there's going to be someone in your organization that wants to put their name on it and help you drive that velocity for scale across the organization, or to make it the as Rudy says, the enterprise standard. It's about sort of thinking about the organization holistically, and targeting that right person in your organization that you want to team with and that you want to help to scale their business and your business together. Rudy, any other techniques that you found that worked in the past?
Yeah, I'll just add, you mentioned a lot, but I would add two things. One concept which you mentioned before is figure out a way in which how this solution actually makes them look good, right? So it's not just is it important to them, but get to the point where you could say, hey, how can the solution actually give you a win, right? In with your objectives, and then the second thing is, I think if you can get to that relationship, the other role that's really critical on having that sponsorship is, when you're talking about paths to scale and you're talking about driving, process change, the role of the senior executive is really to help you remove blockers and to help you, remove these barriers. And so that's really again, it's part of it is, how do you get them on board? How do you get this to help them look good? But what you need is to get to that point where they can help you in unlocking those barriers in the organization.
All right, sounds good. Last question here. James would like to know, can I or should I involve internal project management resources in this type of solution? Option A, do I do it myself? Am I the stand-in for project management? Option B, do I just rely on the project management staff from the vendor that I'm working with? Rudy, you can go first on this one since I droned on for the last question.
Yeah, I think, So I think ultimately the best model is, you want to be able to do this yourself, right? So professional services based models, right, are inherently always in a they're going to be on some sort of SOW contract time basis. And, we're not going to go back to that slide, but that slide that had, the U in the center with all those things around it, that's a full-time responsibility or more. And so I think that, you can definitely, and this is what we do, we help clients actually accelerate and launch those kinds of initiatives with our resources embedded. But what we really try to do is teach the organization how to fish for themselves, as opposed to being reliant on an external person. So ultimately, I think this is a way of doing business. It's your transformation, and you should be able to ultimately drive this yourself in the long run. While that may not be practical in the short term, but I just say in the long term, your strategy should be to do this yourself.
All right, sounds good. I have one last question with 3 minutes left. Doug, if you're still on the webinar, I'm going to try not to butcher your question since it was flashed in front of me on a piece of paper. Rudy, this question is for you. Doug would like to know if you have one great success story or one great catastrophic failure that you would like to point to. Success, obviously, when your framework was used for a deployment, or catastrophic failure when your deployment was not used for a deployment.
Yeah.
Pick one example and tell us.
Okay, sure. Let me tell you one that did not go as planned, and I'll tell you it's in the CMS space. I talked about this before. I'm going to leave brand names out of both the organization and the vendor, but we went into a project where the initial assumption, the assumption had already been a foregone conclusion that what they needed was a content management system, and but they had come from an environment where the organization had been used to hand-coded HTML, right? And it's basically called handcrafted web pages with very little controls around that. And people were complaining about how long it was taking to actually get these web pages to into production. But the real problem was they actually didn't need a CMS. They actually needed a faster way to actually load custom HTML, right? Because the organization hadn't wrapped itself around the discipline of a repeatable content management process and all that comes with it. So the long story short is, we stepped into an environment where there was already a foregone conclusion around a solution, but we were actually we weren't solving the right problem. And had we been at the point where we could, really understand what the actual problem was, what the dynamics and the culture and this concept of work process and work methods that people are used to and policies versus the way software was intended to be built, I would say that was an example of where in fact it reinforces the model. If you look back retrospectively, this is exactly why that didn't work. Why they ended up, it's because this methodology was not followed. So I think we're at time now. So I'll happy to, after the call, if anybody wants to hear all of our success stories as well.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ray. I appreciate the comic relief on the catastrophic failure. So everyone, that concludes today's webinar. I appreciate everyone's time today. Hopefully you took at least one takeaway away from us today. If there's any other questions, feel free to reach out. Our direct contact information is in the deck that you will receive in the next couple of days. For anyone else that has any other questions, again, feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you.